through there. Big one. It's not just starting off.
We're so good.
Good to hear.
Oh, we're gonna have more people in here, but you know, we get a lot on the replay, so.
Right?
Thanks. Right, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started because it's
10.
all right.
So, Valerie, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Happy.
So, Valerie Brader is the first in our winter speaker series. We're very excited to have her. Before we start our conversation, just wanted to introduce for folks that aren't familiar that we did a speaker series in the fall. They're all available on YouTube, so you can go back and watch them if you're interested. Had a great lineup, and we have an awesome lineup for the winter semester too. After Valerie, we've got Jonathan Smith, who is Deputy Director at Leo and the head of an office that I can't remember all the words, but it's like Community and Worker Economic Transitions. It was created by the legislation in 2023 to help as we're transitioning our economy towards lower carbon devices, vehicles, that sort of thing. And then our speaker after that is Regina Strong, who is the Environmental Justice Public Advocate for the state of Michigan. So really looking forward to having Regina. And then our final speaker is going to be Hillary Doe, who's the Chief Growth Officer for the state of Michigan. So in April. So please join us, same time, same place, Tuesday mornings at 10 for the next, one each month for the next few months. So, but I'm super excited to get us started with our first speaker, who is Valerie Brader. So I'm going to let Valerie talk to us a little bit about her career path and help you all kind of understand what brings her to my chair here this morning. But before I ask her to do that, I just want to say that Valerie is somebody who I've truly appreciated working with over the course of the years. She's somebody that has really deep values. And I think that in many cases, our values are strongly aligned, even though maybe our tactics look a little different. And I've always felt really fortunate to have somebody that I can talk to that looks at the world a little bit differently than I do so that I can be broader in my thinking. And so I'm really grateful, Valerie, that you've done that for me. So thank you.
Not for me too, so thank you.
And thank you for being here. And so if you'd like to start, it'd be wonderful to share with the folks here and listening online a little bit about your career path and how you got to this seat in particular. And is your mic on?
I don't know. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. There's a little light. You switch the little button. Oh, wait, it's here.
Yes.
There we go. We want to make sure everybody can hear you.
That's fair. I actually first got into the environmental world because I got an internship with the governor's office in Idaho one summer. And Idaho, unlike Michigan, the legislature is done in April. So there's, basically during the summer, not a lot that happens policy-wise.
Heavenly.
It really was. And continues to be, I think. But the office was sort of like, well, what do you want to do? And, it's Idaho, something always catches fire in the summer. So I was like, oh, I'll do natural resources because I'll work the fire desk, like stuff will happen. And I ended up getting really into a lot of different issues that I hadn't thought about before. Idaho has a lot of hydropower. So I got into the whole idea of having that sort of renewable resource and how that contributed to our power affordability, but also how that created complications for the endangered salmon and steelhead and the Dolly Varden, the interaction between the federal and the state government over federal lands. I got to have a very embarrassing meeting in which we were meeting with some officials then of the Clinton administration. I was sent to it to represent the office. It was all about the NRA. They seemed very positive about the NRA. I was a little surprised, but was going with it. And I finished the whole meeting and I came back and I reported, and it turned out we were talking about the Sawtooth National Recreation Area, and I had done the entire meeting completely unaware of what it was about. So, in the future, always look up the acronym before the meeting would be a good advice to your students. But anyway, I got really involved in the policy, and then I was going to school back east and realizing that a lot of the people I was interacting with did not have sort of the depth of knowledge about how it tied to the economy. The environment was for a lot of Western states, and how much the federal government also dominated the conversation given the land. So I started to get more and more into that. I was getting really interested in water regulation because the type of pollution issues you get in places with a lot of water versus very little water are a little different, but we're trying to apply the exact same regs in most cases. And so I just started to get more and more into this and realized this is where my career was taking me. So then I began to talk to like everybody I knew about, hey, if this is what I want to do, what should I do, educationally? And a few of them told me I should get my PhD, and I was not excited about that much more school. And then, but the vast, vast majority of people kept telling me to be a lawyer because lawyers really had as much influence in many cases, they felt, as the kind of technical professionals. And especially if you had any technical background, that made you sort of a gem. So I got a master's of science in soil erosion modeling. I did that because it turned out all the funding for soil erosion modeling had come about in like the 40s and 50s because everyone was scared of the Dust Bowl. And so essentially everyone who studied soil erosion modeling at the time I was in grad school was like a 60-year-old man who had never had a young woman faintly interested in what they studied. And they were super generous with their time. So I was able to learn a lot about soil erosion modeling in a very quick time, be able to publish from that. And then I went to law school knowing that that was really what I wanted to do. I worked while in law school for a government consultancy supporting the DoD with their environmental reviews. And then in all of that, I fell in love with a man who got a job at the University of Michigan, which brought us here. And I ended up starting my career working for the federal judge in Detroit, who was overseeing the Detroit Water and Sewer Department for their environmental problems that they had been ongoing since 1 year after my birth. I told him I was going to be the last clerk who was older than the case. And that proved to be true. And so I ended up really becoming involved in issues of affordability, the environment, utilities, and rates from like my first days as a lawyer. And then after working for the court for quite a while, I went into private practice where I focused on environmental issues as well as development issues, kind of new businesses starting up, bringing the first battery technology to Michigan. One of my clients was in that industry, so I learned a lot about that. And then ended up also doing a lot on financing, because one thing people were asking lawyers to do is to actually look into, when they wanted to loan money to a project, whether or not they might actually get paid back. So I got into the world of how we set electricity rates because I knew something about water rates, and people were willing to pay me to look up whether or not the approvals they got actually meant they'd get paid. And then Governor Snyder was elected in Michigan, and I knew from my days working in the Detroit Water and Sewer Department issues, Bill Rustum, who was his head of policy and who is one of the like Michigan gurus of all things environment, has been for years. So I told him, hey, I know your guys are full up because you're at the beginning, but like, if you need someone a few years from now or whatever, let me know. I'm really interested. And he was like, do you know anything about energy? And I was like, yeah. And I kind of told about the financing work I've been doing. And he was like, oh, perfect. Something about energy, but you're not like working for either the utilities or the people who battle the utilities, which are usually the two groups of people who know anything about it. And so he asked about my resume. I mean, I didn't. I was there to actually do a client thing. And I sent it in, and I was hired in as the chief energy policy officer for the state. And then they kept changing my titles, but that was basically what I did for the next 7 years, and including then standing up the Michigan Agency for Energy, which was a kind of clearinghouse for the energy policy that was not purely kind of the administrative decision making, and kind of pulling those people together there. And then passing the 2016 comprehensive energy reform was also a major thing I did, as well as helping the UPs transition away from coal. That also happened in that during that tenure. And then I left the administration and have been in private practice as a lawyer and as a consultant since. And so that's sort of my career trajectory in the sustainability area.
Yeah, you touch on a lot of things that I think that the student body at SEAS is super interested in, and a lot of, I think because of your experience, you've had exposure in a lot of those different places. So one of the things that we say a lot is that it's really good to have a methodological background, but to have a foot solid in one discipline, but to be able to see all these disciplines. And so you certainly have, from a policy perspective, regulatory perspective, finance perspective. I think a lot of people don't understand that the energy world so much is the finance world, because really that's what the Public Service Commission does, is they regulate rates, and it's not actually about I mean, it is about energy, but it's about the regulatory, the economic side of it.
Yeah, I mean, and even outside of the regulatory side, which is in energy primarily driven by financial regulation of rates, although obviously pollution laws play into that too. Just in terms of business, what gets funded, and what's sticky. You can have some things that are policy driven, but that aren't otherwise economically sticky. Ethanol plants would be a great example. They're always like right on the brink financially, because basically it's all about what a particular regulatory trigger is pulled that year, and there's some flexibility. So like every year is how much, will this make sense? We don't know. Versus some of the solar and kind of rooftop solar and things. Yes, it's expensive at the top, so you have a lot of equity issues, but there are very few people for whom that won't pay off in the long run, right? And so I think if you think about what kind of measures that you take in the sustainability area are likely to kind of stick and self-propagate versus those that are going to have to be more difficult. If you first look at where the finances are, you're much more likely to predict something that will take off on its own versus something that's going to need continued kind of governmental firmness on that particular policy to be viable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's what I find really fascinating is the policy side of it and how we get to the outcomes. So through that framework. Okay, so you've spent time in the public sector and private sector. We've got students that are interested in both the public sector and the private sector. Can you talk a little bit about those differences from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of my career, my stints in public service have like really catapulted my ability to succeed in the private sector, because you meet a lot of people and you meet them quickly and you get to meet them on things that they think are important enough to like try to talk to the governor about. And so like both of those stints, both in Idaho for Governor Batt and in Michigan for Governor Snyder, I just met many, many, many more people and learned about where they saw their businesses going or where they saw their policy goals going, or where they saw major problems, for vulnerable people. Like you just get exposure to so many more things. And you also get a real quick sense of what your limits are, and what a lot of things that can be fixed better in other ways versus things that really do require government action. You kind of have to get a sense for that very, very quickly. And understand the politics of getting things done and the financing on the back end of when the money will or will not come forward for various initiatives. So the public service and it also just allows you younger to have more authority. Like had I stayed at my law firm, the point at which I might be the manager of a multi-million-dollar budget would have been a lot farther than in government, where I, did that in my early 40s. And we came in on budget every year, just for what it's worth. And executed all my requirements while staying under budget. But that's the kind of thing that government gives younger people, really, is a chance to have a lot of authority. But the private sector is really where the power is, in my view, and always has been, because it really is driven by what people think is possible, by what people view, and what they can get on the ground. And so, and really the economic lifeblood of any state or region or area is going to drive how much resources are even available to attack problems or support infrastructure or do all those things. So I actually do prefer the private sector to the public sector, but I could not be doing the exciting work I'm doing in the private sector and have the influence I've been able to have in the private sector without that experience in the public sector. So I think, frankly, having a mix is probably the most satisfying career, I would say, for many people. I guess there are people who love working in government their whole lives. There are people who, just hate government work, would love to be in the private sector their whole lives, and that's good. But I think for a lot of people who are more interested in kind of the issue area than how they do it, having a mix can be really valuable.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, that it's the issue area, and then the different career paths. I want to talk about your work. I'm really excited about some of the projects that you're working on. But before we go there, I do think it's important just to kind of keep consistency with the other speakers and answer some questions that I hope will help the student body. So one is, what advice do you have for yourself in college now that you wish you could give yourself back then?
Oh, sleep more. You will actually remember more of what you're studying if you actually sleep. I wish I had known that. I did not sleep very well. And I'm like, wow, like in retrospect, I'm like, it would have taken less effort, less time if I had just slept. I would have read faster for one thing.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Going backwards and thinking about your career path, knowing that there's still a lot of it in front of you, I would just like to say,
I hope so.
I hope so too. What are you most proud of it as an accomplishment?
I think there are two things I'm most proud of. The first actually is the 2016 energy legislation that passed in Michigan. It is the only law, I believe, although I'd be delighted to be wrong, that contained both increases in the amount of energy waste reduction or energy efficiency that people were required to do, people being utilities, as well as an increase in renewables. Did a lot on some other issues too, and got bipartisan support. I think it's the only law of that type to ever pass with a Republican trifecta, meaning House, Senate, and governors all being Republican. I think we did it very deliberately. We learned a lot. We had 2/3 support in both chambers. So not just token bipartisan, like, hey, I got one person I can call bipartisan now, but like genuinely bipartisan. And I know you didn't like love it at the end. But it is one of my favorite accomplishments because I really did feel we built consensus around very difficult issues, and we built a framework that moved forward without merely like an argument about mandates. It really made reliability and affordability and sustainability all considered at once. And I think we ended up picking very good, no regrets projects as a result. So I'm really proud of that. And then on the private side, it sounds sort of small, but during COVID, I kept my church preschool open by getting them grants and getting things like that. And it sounds silly, and it's not in my central area. And my kid was too old for it, so it wasn't self-centered, but they would have closed. I don't think they would have reopened without a lawyer who was willing to just like figure it out with them and get them the funding, get them staffing, figure out the regs, get the building in shape to do that. So, and today it's still serving like 60 kids a year, not big, not that big, but actually, as I was reflecting on your questions, that is one of the things I'm most proud of, because it's one of those things that just, I don't think would have happened if I hadn't personally decided to do it, even though it wasn't like something I would normally do.
Yeah, well, that's really meaningful. And it's a great metric of your commitment to community. And I should mention that we both have sons named Finn, which is right. How great is that? Mine's older. And as a brief aside, just got into University of Michigan on Friday. Yay. Engineering. So anyway.
So did my former intern.
Proud moment. Phew. Stress is off for the next couple of months. So do you want to talk about it? I love IRPs. I'll be honest. I'm a little, yeah. Do you want to do like just 3 minutes on an IRP? Just because I think anytime we get a chance to like educate people on IRPs, we should.
Yeah. So an IRP stands for an integrated resource plan, where a utility looks at all of their options to meet their both legal requirements and also power demands. So they forecast how much they're going to need to have and what would be the best way to meet it. So in every state but Michigan, it is a plan that has one of these. It is a planning process only. Michigan in 2016 took a really important step, I feel, that led to its success and made it the driver for utility investment, which was, if you could prove to the commission that your plan was the most reasonable and prudent. So not just a reasonable or prudent thing to do, but like the best thing that people could think of to do, given the knowledge at the time, your funding to carry that out was guaranteed at that time. Now, yeah, if you're like grossly negligent or something, they can claw it back. And there was a provision for, hey, if the world really changes and we all agree this wasn't a good idea anymore, like, can I stop but keep what I already spent instead of just like that's a wash or I got to fight for it. And what that did is that unlike every other state in the country, Michigan's utilities had virtually all of their major investments run through that process because no other process gave them that pre-approval. And that meant that there was a lot more interaction with all the different kind of interests, from the industrial customers to the environmental groups to the kind of affordability, champions, to the developers themselves, sort of saying what was possible, and the utility staff and the commissioners, right? All the public servants who also weigh in. So when you look at where Michigan made its investments, it tended to do them in settlements where everyone had to agree, or through the sort of negotiated with the regulator of, okay, yeah, this is the best. No other state had the utility investments match the plan as well as Michigan. And no other state saw utilities preference like that kind of mechanism. And so I think that what was underappreciated about the 2016 law, frankly, nationally, was the durability of the investments it created and the paradigm shift it gave, because utilities were coming for regulatory approval before they did something. So they were not yet completely dug in on, I have got to get this approved, or, I just lost the company tens of millions of dollars, which tends to make them pretty rigid, as you might guess. So they were coming in before the money had been spent, but they also knew that if they could get this approved, they could spend the money. And even if it, like, the world changes and it turns out to be a bad idea, they wouldn't be out the money. So they were more willing to take chances on newer technologies like storage than they would otherwise have been, because they were like, no one's done these before, but if everybody agrees it's the best idea, well, we'll install it. And if it turns out that like the technology is horrible or whatever, and I need to stop, I am not just out the money, like, you are in on this deal with me. So it created a willingness to both talk about what the utility really planned to build and to take some chances in what they would try, that normal utility regulation really discourages them from doing. And I think we often think of utilities as like very unwilling to like change or whatever, and we don't look at the financial realities of why that might be true. And the IRP flipped those financial realities. And one thing I'm a little disappointed on is that in the new law, the IRP, I don't think, is going to drive most of the investments in the next 8 years, just because of the way the legislation was structured. And I am sort of sad that we are missing that opportunity, because you're missing the opportunity to say we're building this because everyone agrees it's the best thing. Now the argument, well, we're building this because we have a mandate that is believed to be the best thing, where you sort of lose that. No, we looked and it is the most affordable. It will protect reliability. You lose that as a driving force for it. So you give the utilities certainty that if they build it, they'll get paid because there's a mandate, but you've removed that level of sort of engagement around those other values. And I do think the utilities will not use the IRP if they can use something where there's less of that sort of interchange to the same degree. And so, to be honest, like, I am a little disappointed with that, but I do hope that other states look at the power of tying financial payments to the IRP and learn from Michigan, because I think it did save people a lot of money and it did advance both reliability and affordability in ways that weren't happening before that.
To me, it's another great example of why planning is important. It's a different kind of plan. Obviously, it's a regulatory plan, financial modeling, et cetera. But it's demonstrates why planning is so significant, getting people together to collaborate and think about what do we want to look like in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. So
yeah, and how does this investment interact with that investment? Not just them saying, well, we're doing this investment. You argue about whether that's a good idea. Now we're doing this investment. You argue about whether it's an idea. You're saying, okay, if you put those together, where does that put us? How do they interact? I just think it's a better way to think about investments. And since basically every utility investment is tens of millions, often hundreds of millions of dollars, like, to me, the more you can think about those things holistically and get the best thinking in, the better.
So one of the other things I really wanted you to talk about, that I didn't tell you ahead of time, but you're going to be fine with it, is, there's a lot of conversation at Seas about how do we communicate and how do we really put ourselves in the shoes of the person across the table from us in the other chair from us. And I think that something that you did with energy efficiency was a really good example of that. And I'm sure you know what I mean. So can you
Sure.
talk about the history of how that happened and what you found in that whole exercise?
Yes, and you're right, because I love talking about this. So thank you for putting it in. So uh, when you talk about like when did the idea of sort of as a policy matter, energy efficiency enter the sort of most people's awareness would be when President Carter encouraged people to put on a sweater. This was during the
Even though
energy-
Nixon did it before.
Yeah,
I was
but no one
reading the
paid
book.
attention to Nixon on that. He was also going to China, and he was also doing some other things that then overwhelmed whatever else he was saying. Yeah, so most people when they think of it, at least if they're older, that is what they click to, and that is not actually energy efficiency. I want to point out that is energy conservation, where I decide I'm going to be a little bit colder to use less and spend less. And there are reasons that you might want to encourage people to do that, but it begins with a language of scarcity. And it also begins with, I'm the very first thing I'm doing is asking you to become more uncomfortable. And like also people are like, yeah, I know how to do that, right? What actually we could really use in Michigan is using less energy to do the same work. Our housing stock is older and smaller than most other states, and thus it doesn't have the kind of insulation and things, which means our folks are spending more to heat the same house, right? Or to cool the same house than they could be. Now, it turns out, especially in West Michigan, where there's that sort of strong Dutch tradition, spending less to do the same is very popular. But energy efficiency, because it has this like sweater association, is not as popular. And so what I learned, and we focus grouped it, and then we tried it in real, what I call the biggest focus group ever, the legislature, and it works like really, really well, is actually describe what you're talking about, which is energy waste reduction. We want to reduce the amount of energy we're wasting. I'm not asking you to put on a sweater. I'm asking you to spend less on your bill, but get your clothes just as dry, your house just as warm, etc. And even better, if you look at who makes insulation, well, Michigan companies with major presence is Dow, right? Major manufacturer of insulation. Who does windows? Like we have lots, actually, more than one window manufacturer based here in Michigan. It is really impossible to improve someone's home or business energy efficiency with labor that isn't located here in Michigan. So it really ends up being both reducing energy waste at the end, frees up more capital to do everything we want to do. It employs Michiganders, it buys the price products. So they're really, for Michigan, it was the obvious solution that needed to be kind of step one. And it became much, much more popular when we described it as energy waste reduction than when the exact same measure was called energy optimization or energy efficiency. You picked up about 10% of support, which is about all you needed. And so it was really a lesson to me because I was like, I'm literally describing the exact same thing. Now, if someone would take a beautiful picture of insulation, that would help. Or otherwise get it, but really helping people to say energy waste reduction, because then also if you didn't want it, you had to explain why you opposed waste reduction, which is a lot harder than explaining why you oppose something that is asking people to be colder, right? So it was a really crucial point that really gained support for the legislation as a whole. And also because integrated resource planning didn't look at it as a pure mandate. It said, we'll go above this if it makes economic sense. It actually drove energy waste reduction to be a major component of energy in a way that if you had tried, even I think with a purely Democratic legislature to say, we're going to have a mandate that you reach this level. And look, it's economically the best thing to do. Dead on arrival. But you take it in the IRP process where you compare it to everything and it wins and it wins and it wins, you end up doing a level of it that would have been politically completely unacceptable as a mandate, which I think is, again, sort of one of the power of the IRP is you just kept doing it. And you were like, well, economically, we should do that. I should pay for my neighbor's installation, not Wyoming's coal, over and over and over.
I think it's a great example. I was reading the MPSC update from last year, yesterday. I'm sure you've looked at it. And, you know, the amount, the trajectory for energy waste reduction is just huge. And I think when Dan was here in the fall, he said that the energy waste reduction in Michigan has allowed avoidance of an entire natural gas plant, maybe even 2. I'm trying to remember. I think it's in the neighborhood of 600 to 700 megawatts.
Yeah,
Huge.
and so he's really excited about that. And I'm just excited about how much money we aren't spending on that. Because if you look at all the needs our businesses have in Michigan to invest and our homeowners have with a largely older housing stock and the number of people who cannot afford their energy easily, it is the power of not having to pay for a gas plant. But to me, it's that hidden power of the money you didn't spend on your electric bill. And you may not even realize it, in the same way, but you just have that breathing room and you're probably making investments you wouldn't have otherwise been able to make or staying in your home longer than you would have been able to stay in it. And even, for our lowest income folks, making sure that your kids don't have to switch schools. Because if you lose utilities, the state may remove your kids from your home as it not being safe. That often means you have to move schools. That often equates with bad educational outcomes long term. So to me, it's one of those like hidden policies that actually makes everything better.
Yep, I think that's a great example. So I want to make sure that I ask you what I told you I was going to ask you, because you always have very pithy, thoughtful questions. Tell us something that surprised you in your state role, and also if there's something that surprised you in your consultancy role.
Yeah, the thing that surprised me in the state role is that if you're trying to meet with so many people, because really politics are relations over and over and over, that you need to put bathroom time in your schedule. Like literally, until I came up with that, I was like, okay, I'm either going to be late or I'm not going to be paying attention to this entire meeting. And I think people do not appreciate, like you hear, oh, government job, like no one who is working in policy, I don't care what administration, I don't care like what elected official, they are pressed for time. They are busy. They are working very, very hard. So I think that, I knew that, but even I was shocked at just how hard people in those positions work. And then the thing that surprised me about consultancy, to be honest, was just how much people misperceive how politics actually happens. Like they have this like view of some weird combination of total corruption and Schoolhouse Rock, like all at once, and they don't actually appreciate how much of it is driven by relationships, how much of it is important that you're telling the story to the elected officials and showing up at the public meetings, things like that, that it can feel like nothing is happening in that. But that actually, I think, long-term kind of bends government more than anything else. Dan Wyant, who is head of DEQ during some of the Snyder administration, has a great saying. He said, government is run by people who show up. And that is absolutely true.
Yep, I think that's really true. What are you most excited about at work in the next 6 months?
Oh, the Ann Arbor Sustainable Energy Utility.
Great, that was on my list.
Okay, here we go. So the Sustainable Energy Utility, which was even more popular than parks on the Ann Arbor ballot, which I was like, wow.
Remind us
I
what
loved
that vote
it.
percentage was.
I believe it was 79.6.
Oh,
Might be 79.4, but I'm rounding up. But it was regardless, nearly 4 in 5 people, which in any election is unheard of. It really will allow Ann Arbor to create a municipal utility that will supplement DTE Electric, but also provide potentially a brand new heating source. Michigan has no geothermal utilities. In fact, its state laws don't even contemplate there being a geothermal utility. So we would, we will be the first to deploy geothermal as a heating source. I'm super excited about this because I think it has some of those same characteristics I talked about for its ability to move forward. When you compare geothermal to natural gas, which it does for heating, it replaces electricity for cooling, but it replaces natural gas for heating. What you're talking about is a system in which utilities can make more money and people can pay less, because it has more kind of infrastructure. It's more expensive to kind of lay and drill and do all the things that set up a network geothermal system than it is a system of natural gas pipes. However, once you get them in there, you never buy fuel. And so utilities make a profit on how much capital they invest. So if you look at the overall amount spent, it's more capital intensive. But by not having any fuel, the person at the end is writing a check for less. And so it is always difficult to install an entirely new utility. It turns out to be expensive and difficult and everything else. But once you get it in the ground, I actually think you can do this in a way that utilities will be excited about it, because a future in which they can make more money is always the future they are excited about. And you will have the potential to lower people's bills at the same time. And if you can put those two things together, I think it will just go. Now, I do want to note that Ann Arbor is also doing an exciting thing about saying it will own those assets from the beginning. So it will have a municipal utility. I think that is also super exciting, because when you go back in time, right? When we were first trying to lay electricity, first trying to lay natural gas, they were having the same kind of challenges we have today. There are lots of things they want to do. This is really expensive. So if they're going to own it, they might have to sacrifice other things to be able to do that. And so they usually should get private capital to do it. Said, okay, you can own it. Now, I think we've now figured out ways where we can attract private capital, but still own it by paying them what they would pay, but not signing up for somebody else owning our infrastructure. So I think that's super exciting. We've been able to learn from the past, faced with the same challenge they were faced with. We've been able to learn from that. So I'm really excited about that. And then on the electricity side, the ability to deploy solar plus storage on people's houses that would be owned by the city, and their businesses as well. It creates the opportunity to lower people's bills compared to what they would otherwise pay, give them more resilience, because if you put in storage, the grid, if it goes down, your house would still be able to island and operate off whatever solar power you have, which is lately an extremely attractive feature. And I will say solar plus storage wouldn't be cheaper than your electric bill, we don't think, although, they keep raising the rates, maybe it would be. But it is definitely cheaper than even just buying a whole house generator, much less running one. So it's a real replacement for a generator, and it's much quieter. It's much, healthier. People are much less likely to accidentally, drag it into their garage and have deaths and things. So I'm very excited about the ability to both help people economically, help people on reliability, plus, of course, the wonderful sustainability benefits that come from moving to an entirely renewable source for both on the geothermal and on the solar and storage. So, and I love also that Ann Arbor's choosing to start in the Bryant neighborhood, which is one of our traditionally majority Black neighborhoods. It was the subject of one of the desegregation orders. That's why you have, for those who are in town, Bryant and Pattongill elementaries. You actually start at one and go to the other. That was why. And so I love that we're starting in that neighborhood. And ironically, some of the reasons people were pushed there make it really great for geothermal. The houses are smaller. They are uniform. There are two patterns. They are, So the things we hate about factory is actually makes it much easier to install geothermal systems, because you know exactly where it's going to go. You can have the same type. You're like, yes, your closet is here. We will put it here. Here we'll do that. We don't have all the design problems that come when you've got these nice bespoke houses, right? As opposed to, okay, they're smaller, they're uniform. There's a city park right there that we can make a common bore field. Also, the playground there if it had to expand. So it is actually, ironically, some of the reasons people were pushed there that it's less attractive really make it a great place to have the first carbon neutral neighborhood. And so I just love that it makes sense for all the kind of feel good reasons. And I don't mean that in like a pejorative sense, like it genuinely makes me feel good. But also if someone was like, yeah, but what do you think about the economics? I'm like, oh, turns out economically, that is also the best place to put it. You know, that's a really great story when things come together that way. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about the SU.
But I'm sure you're excited about the Detroit solar projects
I'm
too.
also excited about
How
the
do you
Detroit
tell us
solar
all about
project.
those?
So I'm also counsel to the city of Detroit on their neighborhood solar program, in which we kind of turned how development works on its head. And this was Mayor Duggan's idea. He said, you know, I'm hearing all this stuff about how people don't like solar near them. But like I also drive around and I think I got all this land and I got these climate goals I want to meet. What if I ask the neighbors to nominate themselves to say, hey, there's a lot of blighted property in my neighborhood. I would like it to be a solar project. And so started by asking people just, do you want it here? And you had to have more than one person who's like, yeah, me, you know, I want it here. You actually, and then hired some local kind of environmental and energy kind of NGOs to work with the neighbors who were like, I'm interested in learning more, and help them get applications in. And in that process, some people who had said, oh, here, were like, oh yeah, actually not here. Like, okay. But a whole lot of neighborhoods said, no, like I really want this. And part of why they wanted it is because if you lived in the area, you know, where the solar might be, you were like one of the two people living in that 40 acres who owned their house, you would have your house purchased, and you would be purchased at a price enough that you could actually buy another house, right? That you could move to some place where you would actually have neighbors, and you know, essentially have that community again, because many of these people were living in houses and felt trapped. And then if you were renting a home in that area, you would get a year and a half of comparable, you know, rent free, you know, plus the moving expenses. So we were not discouraging people who were living or renting in the city from this. And then if you were part of the people who would live in the area, who own their own home, you know, in the surrounding area, you would receive, depending on how big the amount of the solar acreage was going to be, between $15,000 and $25,000 to invest into energy waste reduction in your home or solar. Or I think storage was allowed. I can't remember. That was like back and forth. So I apologize. I can't remember if that's in there. But and also that the money would be like freed up to do the kind of repairs that might be necessary to do in insulation or something. So sometimes what you come up with in these projects, especially within the really older homes in Detroit, is that you'd have to fix something. Like you'd have to get the asbestos out before you could put in something. And there's funding for putting in something, but not for fixing the thing that makes it necessary to put in. These funds could be used that way too. So they could really supercharge people's ability to use like weatherization funding and other things too. So we were restoring the strength of the neighborhoods that would remain while creating solar that will power the, you know, is equivalent to powering the city's buildings, and all with residents saying, I want it here, not I don't want it here. And so all of that passed the city council, both phase 1 and I believe phase 2 has now passed, or it is up for things, meaning that these projects are going forward and there will be 6 kind of, you know, not huge utility scale, but definitely utility scale projects, reusing blighted land, rebuilding the neighborhoods, and all at the residents' kind of direction. The residents get a say on what the fencing is going to look like, they really get some say into what goes into their neighborhoods. And that has been, it was legally enormously difficult to like figure out how you put all those things together. But it has been just so satisfying to see that come about, and especially to see the residents react to it. It has really been a special project to get a chance to work on.
Yeah, those are both two really cool examples of implementation that you've been such an architect of. I think it's awesome.
Well, yeah, they were other people's ideas totally in the Detroit thing, but I was really happy to help to make it reality because it was hard.
All right, one more question before we do lightning round and then let the audience have a few questions. There's been a lot of conversation in the last few weeks, particularly at SEAS, about how do students get involved? What type of action can students take so that they are having agency over some of the challenges that they see at the global level that maybe they don't feel like our friends at the federal level are executing in the same way. What do you think about that? What sort of response would you have as students are thinking about how do they fit into the decarbonization goals, that the urgency that they're seeing for the globe right now?
I would say lean into affordability, because when something makes financial sense, sort of regardless of who's got pens and chairs, it tends to happen. So I think I think there's been sort of a tendency generally to like lean into, I got to get something passed. But if you look at what has made some of the biggest changes in terms of climate, there's stuff we don't even talk about, like we invented in, the heating and cooling space, much more efficient air conditioners and furnaces. This was basically like, you couldn't have gotten 3 people to sit in a room and hear about that when it first came out. But if you look at the impact about how much less energy we're using because of this as a country, how much more money people have, the likelihood they can afford to heat their home, that was one of the most breakthrough innovations we've had. And we don't talk about it at all because it was like, well, yeah, I would buy that furnace, right? It's gonna be a lot cheaper. Right. And now we've got utility incentives to help people realize they should buy that furnace. Right. But the utility incentive did not drive that. The technology that made it cheaper drove that. And then people noticing that led to sort of a policy, but the policy only worked because the fundamental economics worked. And so I would say, whenever you're thinking about your career, if you can lean in to those solutions that are economically going to work, maybe they need maybe it's startup, so it needs to get over that first hump, or you need a certain number of customers and then it works. Like those things, if you can get them over that that like bump, and then they are economically self-sustaining, you're going to have a huge impact no matter who's sitting in a governor's chair, a legislator's chair, the White House, like that. It will feed itself if it is economically like over that hump. And so my advice to students, no matter your kind of political persuasion, no matter your interest, is lean into those things that are either already making economic sense or going to make economic sense, and try to turbocharge them because they pick up momentum on their own.
That's great advice. Okay, lightning round. Favorite place?
In Michigan is the Michigan Legacy Art Park up by Crystal Mountain.
Yeah.
It's they ask for a donation, but it is amazing. One of my favorite summer hikes.
It's beautiful. First job?
My first job was teaching swimming. Chicken, eagle, swoosh. I'm really good at chicken, eagle, swoosh.
Recent book or podcast that you think everybody should listen to or read?
Well, if you're interested in this Politico energy, so that would be my boring one. I don't always agree with their politics, but Lawyers Behaving Badly is hilarious. It's stories about lawyers who have made massive ethical violations and their punishments told by 2 women who make fun of them incessantly, and I love it.
I'm going to send that to my oldest because he loves strict scrutiny, so I bet he'd be all over that.
Oh yeah, Lawyers Behaving Badly.
Okay, good to know. What never fails to make you laugh?
My son's giggle. Like, it is just contagious to me.
That's what Rachel said.
Oh, really?
Not your son's giggle, but
No, for her.
Sadie's giggle.
Sadie's giggle. Yeah.
Great. All right. I'm sure we've got some questions from the audience. Who's interested in asking a question?
Yeah.
James.
Singing conversation. And one of the things I'm really struck by has been your ability to tie big picture ideas into individual people's reasonable. How do you maintain sort of this bifurcated perception? Like, how do you those are the big goals and the big scale impact. Also, so being so personally invested. You just
Oh, yeah. Basically, I just love getting things done. I don't actually love policy for like policy's sake. Some people do. And my husband likes ideas for ideas' sakes. I don't. As it turns out, I basically only care about what will actually occur on the ground. And so to me, I don't feel that gap, which is not to say it isn't there for many people. But I guess I'm useless in answering your question because I'm like, I literally only care about the policy because of what I think will actually come about on it. Some people feel differently. Some people really do feel like a moral victory in getting certain things to be said. I couldn't care less what you say if you're going to put something on the ground that I think is the right thing. I literally could not say less. Like if you want to like it for a reason I think is fundamentally dumb, great. Happy to have you on the team.
Yeah, what are your take on the Trump policies on the IRA? So it follows through and funding is passed. Seems the biggest on the ground impact. So I'm sure what are some of the things that are better to
I'm just going to repeat that because I should have repeated James. So the question from Mike is, what do you think about Trump's approach to IRA right now? And what could be the potential outcomes if there's a holistic rollback, if there's a partial rollback, and what sort of impact does that have on our future? Good.
yeah, pause funding.
Current pause funding. Yeah.
Yeah, so I did happen to look up CFR 200.1 this morning, which is the citation of the funding that has been paused. I do not believe it in any way touches tax credits, in part because I don't believe the president has has the ability to raise taxes without authorization, which is what would happen if tax credits were part of that sort of authority to pause. Also, the law is pretty clear where there are signed contracts that there is a whole set of government laws. Now you can pause, you can look and make sure that, you know, oh, is it binding, that kind of thing. That is certainly within a president's authority. And I would be very scared if it stopped being in the president's authority to be like, hey, wait, before I write that check, can I check to make sure everything is okay? Like, I think we do want government to have that power. So, the executive order pauses more funding than I believe we spent, which is interesting. Which, you know, if they're right, maybe they should check those contracts. If they're wrong, and they do have binding agreements, I think based on where this administration is, they will wind up in court, you know, over whether or not they have to disgorge those funds would be my guess. I would be very surprised, given the hundreds and hundreds of years of government contracting cases, if it were not found that where there is a binding agreement, that they don't have to do that, as long as Congress has appropriated the funds, right? Pretty much every contract you do with the government is contingent on future appropriations. So if Congress appropriates the funds, I think they don't have a lot of ability to continue that pause. So I think really the question starts to come, what will Congress do with the IRA funding? But for those projects that are largely driven by the tax credits, I don't think this pause affects that, as I read the order, and it never says taxes, right? So, and also there are lots of reasons why nobody of either party wants the president to just not be able to send you your tax refund. Just saying, like, that's a pretty universally, like, you know, desired thing. And so I think that some parts of the IRA are sticky. The other thing I will note is that while I was reading the other executive order that was put out on climate, as I was reading, like, you know, okay, here's their list of things there's an energy emergency about. One of them that is on the list is geothermal. Lots of things are off the list that I think that, you know, obviously that President Biden likes, types, you know, offshore wind and onshore wind and solar, you know, there are things that aren't on the list. But geothermal is something that there is apparently an energy emergency to deploy. And so I was pleased to see that because I think that could be, again, one of the most impactful things we do, because I think once it gets momentum, it will go on its way itself. So we just need to get it over the hump of demonstrating that in this continent, the way it's been demonstrated in other places. And I think it will pick up. And I at least saw language that I could use to say, oh, I guess they really like this and we should do more of it. I agree. That's great.
Yeah, and it's great that the university is working together with the city on geothermal too. So obviously there's a lot happening on campus as well as happening in the surrounding city. I guess the other thing I would say is we are expecting, I think they're calling it the tax Super Bowl out of Congress. And so, you know, I do think that there's going to be conversation about tax credits going forward, because we know there's going to be a tax bill this year. And so just seeing, you know, where the appetite is with the legislature or with Congress to make decisions about where to cut, where not to cut. Of course, it looks like there is a lot of deployment in districts that have the majority in Congress right now. There is only, you know, a 1-seat majority on the Republican side. I continue to think that along the lines of Valerie's thinking, a lot of the technologies that we use for decarbonization are, they're better. They're cheaper, they're easier to use, they're cleaner, they're more appealing to people. And I think that at the end of the day, when that is true, those technologies end up winning out in the long run. So it will be interesting to see how things play out at the federal level. And just, you know, my philosophy on the world right now is I think we all need to work really hard to keep our side of the street clean. Like that's the thing that we can do right now is really, you know, make sure that what we're doing is meaningful and that's a place where we can focus and make some progress and have that personal fulfillment around action. So other questions? Yes.
So I have 2 questions. One, talk a little bit about how some of the utilities can be incentivized to invest in technologies. Like a particular example is the DTE outages. But a lot of the notices that I've had with cars on out has been related to animals. And it seems like the animals have been around, and you know, whether it's squirrels or birds. And so it seems like there should be some other kind of protection or technology, but yet it's just not part of the program. But then, you know, in addition to that, could you also maybe talk about some of the other kind of shifts that are happening, like with nuclear getting started, maybe talking about maybe hydrogen, there's a lot of hydrogen in Michigan, so maybe using that for either storage or for their power. So can you first talk about technology and shifts in power?
Yeah, and literally a decision on almost all the things you just mentioned, which are basically a question about utility innovations and like, can we think about, especially on the reliability side. The Public Service Commission of Michigan actually just issued a decision on Thursday in which I represented some local governments as well as the city of Ann Arbor, and we had positions on this. So I'm going to be repeating my client's position, but I'm not speaking for them. I will hasten to say.
That's your disclaimer.
That's my legally mandated disclaimer. Squirrels have always been a problem. In fact, if you look, the coalition of public power utilities have a little squirrel graph where they show you like, hey, look, spring and fall, you see the most from squirrels. So squirrels have always been a problem. The issue is not really the squirrels, although you do have to be prepared for the squirrels. And we had a big argument about who should pay for outage credits due to squirrels. And the determination is that you should plan for squirrels. Squirrels are a well-known problem, and that is something that if you are getting an outage that lasts a long time due to a squirrel, the DT shareholders should pay that, not the ratepayers. Anyway, so just so you know, we made a decision. Squirrels, predictable. Traffic accidents, predictable. Other things, not necessarily predictable. And so there was a huge debate about this. And for what it's worth, squirrels, predictable. We've known they've always been a problem for the power system. However, one of the things that was really discussed was what kind of investment should DTE be making in the system? DTE wants to install a lot of like automatic controls and closers and things that move power. While those could be a solution, the independent auditors who looked at DTE's solution was like, or you could make sure the tree branches didn't cut into your thing because you are having much higher reliability outages due to tree branches than most, and you trim your trees a lot less often than most. Now, DT doesn't totally like investing in that, neither does consumers, because you know what they make no profit on? Tree trimming, but they make a lot of profit if they have to put in a new wire or a new pole, or new equipment that says, hey, when that tree branch hits, I can switch you over really quickly. So there's a lot of, and Ann Arbor's position was, we want you to focus on the maintenance side rather than on these new technologies, which is not to say we're opposed to the technologies, but we want to make sure that we still need them if you're doing the basic maintenance. So in terms of utility investment, I think that this points to one of the major problems in the way we fund utilities, and that we give them no incentive to do the maintenance, only like angriness, and maybe I won't pay for stuff if you don't, but that's kind of hard to prove. Like what broke earlier because is a little harder to prove than why didn't you trim the tree? Right? Would that line have gone down anyway or not? Right? You're kind of stuck. So I do think it points to one of the problems in our utility funding mechanism, and that we discourage maintenance. And my dad, who was very big on checking the oil, would like be very alarmed about this, right? So that's something I think, you know, we need to think about in how we fund utilities generally, because we do discourage maintenance, but it's one of the most cost-effective things we can do. And so that's one of the reasons why kind of I'm excited that the geothermal utility will be municipally owned, because we won't create that disincentive to maintain it that is naturally built into the way we fund our utilities today. And then in terms of like nuclear and hydrogen and things like that, I think the real concern that people have with both those is the potential for cost overruns and the ability to scale. So the two nuclear plants that have come online in this country in the last 20 years, both went 4 billion over budget, of the budget, initial budget being 2 billion. So that's, you know, a lot more than people planned on spending. And especially in South Carolina, ratepayers got stuck with that. And to some extent in Georgia, but very heavily in South Carolina. And so I think people both like the idea of reusing these plans, you know, the clean power, the jobs, you know, these, you see a lot of bipartisan support for nuclear, but you also see legitimate concerns about, can you really do this for the amount you're telling me? And once I'm halfway in, aren't you just going to tell me we need more and more and more? And I think folks who are seeing that as just an attack on climate or just an attack aren't really being honest about, no, we have to deliver these projects for something like the cost that we estimate, or it really is irresponsible to keep doing that, right? Try something different. Maybe it's small modules, maybe it's other things, but like, it's a legitimate concern regarding the cost of being able to deliver a nuclear power plant, just based on recent experience. It did bankrupt Westinghouse when they tried it the last time. I mean, Westinghouse, right? That's a big company. They bankrupted them. It's a big deal. And then in terms of hydrogen, DTE's system, if you were trying to replace natural gas with hydrogen, can only take about 20% blend before you'd need all new pipes, including not the brand new ones that they're installing today. Even those couldn't handle hydrogen. So I don't actually see hydrogen as something that was going to save the natural gas system, because once I'm installing all new pipes everywhere, I might as well just have installed geothermal, is my take just on the cost of that. So I think hydrogen is very interesting for solutions where you don't have to pipe it as far. But not as interesting for solutions that involve an entirely new network of pipes, which I think is underappreciated for folks.
Yeah, the infrastructure piece of it's really important. People don't think about it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, we just went a little bit over.
Sorry.
No, it was great. So I just want to say to those in the room, thanks for coming. Please take a bagel or two. And for those of you joining online, thanks for joining us. We'll be back on March 11th at 10 o'clock with Jonathan Smith. So hope you can join us then. So thank you, Valerie. Really appreciate it.
It was fun.
Okay.
Thanks for coming. Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it was very nice to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking questions too.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
James always has good questions.